Hello, hello, and welcome to World Affairs. I'm Hana Baba. I host Cross Currents. It's the award-winning daily news magazine on KALW radio in San Francisco. And I also host The Stoop, which is a podcast that tells stories from across the Black diaspora. Today, we're recording the conversation for broadcast on the radio. World Affairs airs on KQED Monday nights at 8 p.m., and it's distributed to NPR stations around the country. Later on in the show, I'll be asking your questions, so make sure to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom to send me your questions, and I'll be happy to ask them. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Ty McCormick and Marianne Hassan. Ty is a senior editor at Foreign Affairs and former Africa editor for the magazine. He's the author of the book we will be exploring today, Beyond the Sand and Sea. In the book, Ty uncovers a family's 30-year journey to the United States. It's a human story, and it gives us a window into the complexities of the global refugee resettlement system. And that window, it's illuminating, but it's also heart-wrenching, and it's very real. It's a story about banning whole countries, banning whole peoples. It's a story about an idea that's central to the American story, that people who are suffering, people who are suffering in their countries can seek refuge here. And what I love about today's program is that we not only have the author of the book, Ty McCormick, but we're also joined by one of the people whose story this is, Marianne Hassan. And I must say, I am a staunch believer in people telling their own stories. That's a lot of what we're about at KALW. I personally believe that with all my heart. So I really, really appreciate that Marianne is here with us today and that we're not talking about her, but we're talking with her. So Marianne Hassan is Somali American. She fled Somali's civil war in 1991 and resettled with her family in Dadaab, a camp in Kenya for refugees. And she was resettled to the US in 2005. And Marianne, in this story, Marianne is a hero, really. Her efforts to support her family and her own journey to asylum in the United States are integral moments in the book. If not for Marianne's bravery and her compassion and her patience and her love for her family, her parents and her brother, Asad, who we'll be talking about later in the program, they may not have been able to be here today, if not for her. So I'm so excited to have her on. Ty joins us from New York. Marianne is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Absolutely. So Ty, one of my favorite chapters is about Marianne, of course. It's called A Sister's Love. And it really, I think, sets the tone for what this book is about. That family connection, that love, that wanting not only for yourself, but wanting for your loved ones as well. So would you be able to give us a little reading from A Sister's Love? And that's chapter 2 of the book.
Yeah. Marianne cradled the phone in the small of her neck, clamping the receiver tight against her chin, and punched the sequence of numbers she hoped would reconnect her to the world she had left behind. The line crackled and clicked over to Kenya's telecom network. It had been hard to keep touch with her family since she arrived in the United States. The $20 international calling card she bought at the 7-Eleven would run out of credit after 5 or 10 minutes. Often she couldn't get through at all because the line in Kenya was down. The separation weighed heavily on her. She felt alone and scared, trapped with a man she didn't love in a tight-knit community that had turned against her. When she and her husband Yusuf had moved into the white apartment complex in North Alvernon Way in Tucson, Arizona, just down the road from the Walmart and the Fred Meyer, she had assumed her parents and siblings would follow close behind. But it had been 6 years since then, and still no word on when the rest of the family would be resettled. Already, they had missed so much of each other's lives: births, Ramadan celebrations, first days of school. Marianne had had 2 new daughters, Ambia and Najma. She had a new baby sister, Habiba, to whom Kaltuma, her mother, had given birth after Marianne left. She had always wanted a little sister, ever since Dahiro had died on the way to Kenya. Now she had one, but they were separated by almost 9,000 miles. Meanwhile, Asad, her brother, had sprouted into a lanky teenager in those stolen years. The memory of him that she still carried with her, of a quiet child of 5 or 6 drawing in the sand with a stick, no longer bore any resemblance to the gangly young man in the family photos he posted on Facebook. Marianne had done everything she could think of to inquire about her family's resettlement case. She had spoken to the representative from the International Rescue Committee, the humanitarian nonprofit that had helped her and her husband settle in their dimly lit one-bedroom that smelled of fresh paint. At first, the IRC staff had said they could see the case in their system and that it looked like it was progressing. But then, after a year or two, the case stopped showing up, as if it had been wiped from the database. Marianne had also sent dozens of emails to Church World Services, the U.S. State Department contractor that vetted refugees in Dadaab for resettlement, as well as to the Joint Voluntary Agency, or JVA, which prepared the travel documents for those who had been approved. She knew she was unlikely to get an answer, but week after week she sent the emails, often when she was too overcome with grief to bother correcting her typos. 6 years ago, my father got approved to come to the USA. My dad is an old man, and he has to take TB medication. After 6 years, he's still in the refugee camp, she wrote on December 18th, 2010, a cool, cloudy day in Tucson. I deserve some answers, I think. I hope someone will take the time to read my email and send me some info.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ty. So that's Ty McCormick. Marianne, what does it feel like hearing Ty reading your story, things that you went through, things that you felt?
Oh, thank you for having me. It's really amazing. I'm very blessed to talk about me and the book, and it just means this is my life. It's not about story to me. I lived this life, and whatever it was, it's like a journey. It was my journey, and it's the truth. So I'm happy, where I am today and how it all went. So I'm glad. I appreciate.
When Ty said he was going to write your life story, what was your reaction?
I felt so compelling. It was so amazing. I felt happy. I wanted somebody to hear me. So that's good. I'm happy that he wrote it. I appreciate.
Ty, if we go back, you met Marianne and her family through Asad that you mentioned in your reading, through reading his articles. Tell us about that. And then what was it about Marianne, Asad, and their parents that drew you to their story?
Yeah. So unfortunately, it was the Trump travel ban that brought Asad, Marianne's brother, and I together for the first time. At the time, I was the Africa editor of Foreign Policy magazine based in Nairobi, and it was a news story that we had to cover. And I had been to Dadaab before, and I was sort of following news from there. And in fact, I had read an article in the New York Times Magazine by a young man who had grown up in the camp, and he wrote about his sister's first return after 14 years. And that was Marianne, and it was Asad. And I filed Asad's name away, and I thought maybe someday down the road there will be an opportunity to reach out to him and offer him a chance to write. Never in a million years did I think he would still be stranded in the camp. I thought for sure that because I was reading his writing in the pages of the New York Times, that he had been one of the lucky few to get out. There are scholarships, a few of them available to refugee students. Of course, quite a lot of refugees get resettled, as Marianne was in 2005. And so I assumed that was his story when I wrote to him a day or two after the Trump travel ban. And I asked him, would you be willing to track down families that are directly affected, people who were expecting to come begin new lives in America, but now are contending with this ban on them? And Asad wrote me back and he said, this is my story. This is my family's story. We've been waiting for 13 years since we were promised resettlement, more than 20 years at that point, since they had fled the war in Somalia. And he wrote something to me to the effect of, the world is working against us. And so I asked if he would write about his family's experience. And he wrote this beautiful, heart-wrenching piece for me at Foreign Policy, telling the story of those 13 years in which he described himself as having been living the American dream that whole time, but not sure how much longer he could bear to live it outside of the United States.
And thank you for correcting that. You are a journalist at Foreign Policy, not Foreign Affairs.
Now at Foreign Affairs, then.
Okay, you did both the foreigns. Go ahead, sorry.
So that was the background for how I met Asad, and of course was immediately taken with Marianne and the rest of the family. It was an idea that had been rattling around in my head actually for a long time. I wrote the book in part because of a profound change in the way refugee crises have played out that has happened over the last 30 years or so. Just in my lifetime, the refugee camps like Dadaab have gone from being temporary safe havens to being places of permanent exile. In 2015 and 2016, during the crisis in the Mediterranean, I think a lot of Americans got a sense that the scale of the refugee crisis was immense, that more people had been displaced then than at any time since World War II. I think what was missing from the conversation then, and still to this extent at this time, was just how long people have been displaced for. There was one statistic in particular that just absolutely blew me away, which is that the average length of what the UN calls a protracted refugee crisis, which is one that's lasted for 6 years and doesn't have an immediate prospect of being resolved. The average length of one of those in the mid-1990s was 8 years. Now it's 26 years. So another way of reading that is that many of these refugee crises have just been frozen in time. Places like Dadaab, places like Kakuma on the other side of Kenya.
Because Asad was born in Dadaab. Like these refugee camps, you describe in the book, they're permanent temporary camps.
Yes.
That's such an interesting way to think about it. This is decades and decades of first generation, second generation people being born in these camps that were meant to be temporary.
Yeah, we now have a second and a third generation grappling with what it means to be a permanent exile. So that's the sort of larger context of the book. Of course, the book focuses on Marianne and her family's incredible 30-year journey. They are in many ways a representative case of what has happened to so many refugees who have waited for three decades now for a place to find home. And of course, there are about 12 million of those people who have been left behind in places like Dadaab and are stranded there indefinitely.
Marianne, since we're talking about Dadaab, can you describe what it was like growing up in Dadaab for those of us who have not seen it and maybe will not see it? Can you describe it?
Dadaab is a refugee camp. It's you're living your life. Sometimes you're a teenager and maybe you're a 20-year-old. You can't do anything. You can't work. You can't help your parents. There's no jobs. So it's kind of very hard, especially young generation. Like you can see your parents struggling and there's nothing you can do for them. You hope just a little bit, maybe a little door that to get out of here and get settlement. And it's hard. It's a lot of kids kill themselves. Last time we went there, me and Ty, there was a kid who killed himself because he felt life is just, there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. And it's a hard place. It's hard.
At the same time, your brother Asad was able to do this process of self-education, which is really fascinating, where he taught himself, English, and he taught himself. He was reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez in the camp. And, if you can talk about that a little bit, this idea of being in a place where you feel, there's no hope and there's nothing to do. But then what does it take for you to be that person who says, actually, I can carve out this little place for me and create myself in that way? Can you talk a little bit about Asad? He seems to me, I wish he was here. And he seems to be an amazing person.
Thank you. Asad is very hard-headed.
But that's what it takes, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. If you think it's not a lot of people who will support you on your education. Even with my mom, she thinks, oh, you're just reading all the time. You lost your eyesight. Stop reading, But he had his own way of dealing with life. You know what? If I'm going to get out of here or do something with my life, I'm just going to be inside the books. And that's what he did. He lived his own life. So it was his own journey that he wanted to be with the books, and it worked for him.
Right. No, excuse me. Absolutely. If we stay with you for a while, Marianne, at some point, if we go back to the time when you were in Dadaab and you were able to escape and go to the big city, go to Nairobi, you made that decision to leave and then leave to the United States and bring your family. How did your family's journey to the U.S. begin? It was very, bumpy and rough is an understatement. It felt like these obstacles, like an obstacle race where you're running and running and running, and then you have to jump over something, and then you run some more, and then somebody throws something. And reading your story, that's what it felt like. Can you describe it to us? Well, what that was like?
First of all, when I was the oldest of my mom's side of the family, so growing up, my dad was old and he lost his eyesight when I was 10. And in young age, all I knew was take care of your family, take care of your parents, take care of this. So I went to Nairobi. I was working, trying to make, how can I help my family? I never had anything else in my head. All I wanted was, how can you support your family? And then all of a sudden we got resettlement to come to America. And I was thinking, oh, this is a good thing. And I came and I was supporting them. I was sending money. I was working.
A lot of money.
Yeah. And I was thinking, oh, they're going to come. It's next year, probably. All the time they go do a medical checkup over and over and over. It was just this hope of never ending and very struggling. So I don't even know how to put it in words. But
well, somebody did put it in words, and his name is Ty McCormick. So Ty, let me go to you for just a little bit. Also, as journalists, often we find ourselves at this crossroad. We're trained not to get involved with our subjects. I hate that word, subjects, by the way, or like characters, subjects. They're people. But there's all, we're trained and we're taught to not to get personally involved and not to help. And at the same time, there's that human instinct to want to help. How did you navigate all of that?
Yeah, I approached the project with a pretty traditional journalistic approach. I didn't expect to deviate too far from my training, as you say, although if I'm being honest, I've always been somewhat skeptical of this idea that we can just subtract our humanity from the equation and check these biases that, of course, we have at the door. I think in many cases they're values that we carry with us when we do our work. And so in a way, it can be a disservice, I think, to try to check those values at the door. In the case of the book, I just found that sort of striving for objectivity became impossible in the context of a project of this magnitude. I mean, Asad and I spent hundreds of hours together going over his story. One of the things I tried to do in the book was to really get inside Asad's and Marianne's head to the extent that I could. Of course, there were huge limitations and barriers for me to do that, but I wanted to try. I wanted to tell the story from the way that it looked to them. And so the early part of the book alternates between the point of view of Asad and Marianne and one other character in the book who's Asad's very good friend growing up, a young man named Becker. And so to do that, it required going over the same, life events from lots of angles over and over. And as Marianne knows, I can be, it's very, I'm sure, very invasive, the degree to which I ask, endless questions. And Marianne has a tremendous amount of patience for me that puts up with all of my questioning. But through that process, it's inevitable that you end up with some human connection to the people that you're writing about. And in this case, it was just such a privilege to get to be a small part of their journey and their family. So what I decided to do in the end was, rather than striving for this impossible standard of objectivity, I thought, well, I'll strive for a standard of honesty, honesty about the story and honesty about the role that I played in it. So in the third section of the book, I sort of come out from the heads of my characters and I tell the story again from my point of view. It's a sort of double chronology where you then learn where I was in all of this and how it looked, and frankly, how much I fretted about how it might play out. Because, of course, when I started writing this project, Asad was not in the US. We didn't know that he was going to win a scholarship to go to Princeton. We didn't know that parts of this story were going to end well. Of course, it's not an altogether happy story. As Marianne will tell you, three of her siblings, but two in particular who are younger, who would like to come, are still stranded in Kenya. And Marianne is working heroically to get them here, working with a lawyer in Washington State, doing everything she can, but it's been a challenge, and they're still there. And so that's part of the ongoing, part of the story.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the book is some wonderful just reporting, right? This is journalism. It's storytelling, but it's also it's reporting and it's information, and it's just setting the stage, right, for this amazing story to unfold. And the stage is pretty bleak. This story about, as a candidate, for example, right now, President Biden promised to raise the limit on refugees resettled here in the U.S. annually because the Trump administration, has had their historic lows, right? And the Biden administration said that once they were in office, the goal would be, it would be realized in the 2022 fiscal year, which begins in October. But last week, the Biden administration said it would keep the current level of refugees, which is abysmally low, until it sets a, quote, final increased refugee cap on May 15th. The White House press secretary said Monday that the challenge is the ability to process increased number of refugees. We know there is a huge backlog. What did you want people to understand about this broken refugee system through this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's one way to read this book, which is as a narrative of triumph over obstacles in a way. And I think that what I hope people take away is a better sense of those obstacles themselves.
It's a human triumph over obstacles. It's like the humans trying to solve what the systems could not.
Exactly. And it's the systems that is what I hope people come away with a better sense of. So much of this is invisible to people who don't have to go through it. I think people like Marianne have such an incredible knowledge of this faceless bureaucracy that to the rest of us just operates kind of at a low level in the background. But it has this tremendous ability to make decisions that affect people's lives, life-ending decisions in some cases. And so that's really what I was trying to do. A big part of the book is the story of refugee resettlement in the United States, which I think a lot of people maybe aren't aware just how many refugees the United States has resettled over since 1980. Of course, this is a country with a very checkered history in this department. We turned away Jewish refugees in the 1930s. We turned away South Vietnamese refugees in the 70s. Over and over again, there have been waves of refugees that have been turned back. But there have also been waves of refugees that have been welcomed. And since 1980, the United States has actually been pretty good in this department. And we've resettled 3 out of 4 refugees that were resettled anywhere in the world since 1980, 3 million out of 4 million people. In any given year, the United States is resettling more refugees than the rest of the world combined, than the 36 or 37 designated refugee resettlement countries put together, places like Canada, the UK, Australia. The Trump presidency brought that to a screeching halt. Dadaab arguably was the place that was the most affected on a per capita basis. On the day that Trump's travel ban came into effect, something like 14,000 people in Dadaab were at some stage of the process to get resettled to the United States. Just 8 people were resettled in 2018 from Dadaab, and 14 were resettled in 2019. So overnight, the entire humanitarian apparatus geared toward giving people better lives was shut down. There was no flights. There was no vetting. There was nothing. And so this is the story of what it means to throw that away for a country. What does it mean to be in a place where you give away something that had been the envy of the world, that had given people hope? That, I think you can toss that around in a way that maybe doesn't sound sincere, but certainly every time I've traveled to Dadaab, I think that has meaning. That the United States was seen as a beacon of hope. But it was really not seen that way the last time Marianne and I went back to the camp, and we had given all of that up. So to see the Biden administration not race to restore something that was such an integral part of America's way that it presents itself as a leading power, as a soft power tool, as a way of leading by example, has been really disappointing. And I think that it's obviously been gotten tied up with an issue that is on a policy level, a totally separate issue, which is the asylum claims at the border. But it's a really simple fix in some ways. You restore that cap, which the Biden administration seems really reluctant to do, to raise this back to what it was, or even to exceed it, as he promised to do on the campaign trail. He said he would raise it to 125,000, which he's yet to do, and he's yet to amend Trump's cap.
And you recently wrote about this in a New York Times op-ed. What will it take to undo this damage that the Trump administration did to refugee policy? Even if the Biden administration immediately kind of jumped on it, what would need to be done?
Yeah, even if we weren't where we are now, which is essentially nowhere, the Trump refugee regime is in many cases still largely intact. Even if the Biden administration had decided to get to work on day one rectifying this, it would have been a huge, huge lift, because so much damage was done to the system by essentially shutting it down with no warning overnight. It's an imperfect analogy, but like any piece of heavy machinery, if you shut it down, it's tremendously expensive to keep it from being damaged. You shut down an oil pipeline overnight, you do millions and millions of dollars of damage to it. That's true of the refugee pipeline as well. Resettlement agencies had to close their doors. They had to lay people off. A tremendous amount of human capital that was geared toward helping people when they arrive. When Marianne arrived in the U.S., the international rescue community was there waiting to help her resettle in an apartment and to get trained. And she'll be better at telling this than I will. But there's a tremendous amount that goes into making sure that refugees can land on their feet when they get here. And all of that has been set back and will take years, I think, before it's back up and running at the level that it needs to be. And I should also add that even if it were to be restored to the level, we're still nowhere close to addressing the global need for resettlement. This is a system that resettles globally through the UN less than 1% of refugees every year, which is why you have ended up with this age of encampment with people who are stranded for generations and generations. It's because only a tiny number of the people who need homes, need new countries, are given them. And so really, actually, if you were serious about fixing the problem, you wouldn't just need to restore the old refugee resettlement system. You would need to build it, expand it, rally new countries to take part in it, and really begin to make a dent in the backlog of people who are waiting and have been waiting for generations.
And just a reminder to our audience, we do have a chat going, and we will be taking a couple of your questions really soon. So if you're curious about anything, you have a question for Marianne, you have a question for Ty, please type it in, and we will get to it. Marianne, the Muslim ban. I'm from Sudan. My family's from Sudan. And you're from Somalia, two of the countries that were a part of that Trump Muslim ban. It felt personal. It felt like, you and your people are unwanted. It felt like you aren't welcome. It felt like you're seen with suspicion. And this idea that, and the ugly word that Trump used that I can't say, the S-hole countries. We don't want people from those countries, right? And it was a lot, and it was building up, and I felt it. I'm sure you felt it as well. And it happened at a time that your family was just about to come. You had gone through so much to try to get your family here, and those hurdles we were talking about, and you were at the finish line. You were at that finish line, and then this Muslim ban was dropped.
It was very personal for me, so I don't know.
So tell me what was going through your head at that time. How did you keep your strength and your hope? Because it was a hopeless time for a lot of people.
I felt, why me? That's the only thing came out. It was, why me? Why us? Why now? My parents were in Nairobi in a hotel paying all that, and the shutdown happened, and I was like, not now, please, not now.
They were about to fly over here.
Yeah, my dad just got the visa, and he was like literally almost flying, and that shutdown happened, and it was very hard. It was very painful. It was why us? Why now? What have we ever done? What are we doing wrong? It was just,
yeah.
I don't even know if I can.
Yeah.
It was
a lot.
Good. It was a scary moment.
It was scary, and I think Ty, in the book, there was a part where it was in the refugee camp, and Assad. It was 2015. Al-Shabaab had just launched an attack in Kenya, and somebody came to Assad and said, I think it would be a good idea if you could write a letter of apology on behalf of all Somali people. And Assad said, no, I'm not doing that. I had nothing to do with that. I'm not a terrorist. I'm not going to be an apologist for terrorists. That's them. This is me. And that seems to be a question that's at the center of all of this idea of suspicion, these people, with terrorist tendencies, that whole conversation. To what extent is it really about that, or is it about something else?
That's certainly part of certainly part of Assad's experience growing up. I think that one of the many layers of disadvantage that people have who live in the refugee camps is there is a fair amount of anti-Somali sentiment in Kenya, and that, of course, has been fueled by actual terrorist attacks. There have been terrorist attacks. It's not an imaginary threat, but it's been projected onto the whole population in the same way that it has in the US. And so this was something that Asad dealt with his whole childhood, both in the disdain of the Kenyan aid workers for the Somali refugees in the camp. Then when he went to a school in interior Kenya where he was the only Somali in the whole town, and his other classmates joked that he was a member of Al-Shabaab and teased him behind his back, all the way through growing up. And then I think what was heartbreaking for me as his friend at this point was to see him encounter it all over again here in the US when he arrived in the US, thinking that finally, or hoping that finally, he had found a country that he would belong in. That was also part of why he traveled back to Somalia. Before he came here, he went on a journey with his friend Becker back to Somalia, traveled through some of the most war-torn parts of the country, because he'd never been to his home country. He'd never seen, his parents' home country. But he was looking to see if there was a place that he belonged, because he had never felt that he belonged in Kenya. Kenya, of course, told him explicitly, by not recognizing him as a citizen, that he did not belong. When he applied to Princeton, he had to fill out a citizenship field and the common application. There was no option for a stateless person. He had to choose, am I Kenyan, am I Somali? And he decided that Somali was the smaller lie, because Kenya had explicitly told him that he was not a citizen. And so he goes back to Somalia. He finds that in some ways he can connect to the culture there, but in other ways he finds that he's a misfit, and that he's still searching for this place that where he will belong. And I hoped fervently that would be New York. Of course, everyone belongs in New York. And in some ways, I think that he's found that here. But in other ways, he arrived in the middle of the Trump presidency when we were not showing our best face to the rest of the world. And we had turned inward and smaller and meaner in a way that weighed really heavily on him. It was obvious to me that I think he was disappointed by the America that he encountered. And
I know in Sudan, when a foreign journalist shows up, at least maybe now not, since we've had a revolution, hopefully things have changed. But in the past 30 years under a dictatorship, when the white journalist shows up in town, there's a kind of like, what is he doing here? And what's the story here? And there's a little suspicion, and there's a little, what was it like in Kenya? Was it easy to get to report from Dadaab? And what was your experience like?
Dadaab is not an easy place to report from, in part because of all of the restrictions that the Kenyan government puts in place to keep people from leaving and from coming in. In the book, I compared Dadaab to the fictional town of Macondo, cut off from civilization by, in Garcia Marquez's language, measureless swamps and forbidding mountain ranges. And Dadaab is also, cut off from civilization, and like Macondo, it's visited by only a very few foreign travelers, myself included, and Marianne included as part of the book. And so, no, it's incredibly difficult. There are all sorts of ways in which the government tries to prevent you from actually reaching the people you might want to speak with. And it is, of course, there are limitations on the model of foreign correspondence, that you are necessarily an outsider. You will never be able to see things or narrate stories the way that people who live them do. I think what was neat about the experience of writing this book was that I felt that Asad and Maryan were guides to me in their world. And in a more limited way, I could be guides about my world to them. And so we each got to see each other's worlds through one another's eyes to a degree.
Right, because there's a lot of talk about, who tells whose story. And so, again, I'm so glad Marianne is with us. And it sounds like they were, a huge part of the telling of their own story. So I think that's something to be appreciated. for sure. So again, if you have any comments or questions, make sure to put them in the chat. We'll get to them in a little bit. Marianne, you've carried a lot on your shoulders. This story is a lot about your strength, your resilience. You've always wanted to be independent. Your father also wanted you to be independent. You know, he was the camp Quran reader. And you know, he always made this distinction between culture and religion, and always told you that Islam is, you know, gave you your rights, and Islam is not holding you back. It's culture. And he supported you in becoming this young, independent woman. And that's not a story many people here in the West hear about Muslim women. There are huge, you know, stereotypes about Muslim women, that they are oppressed, that we don't have a voice. Whereas we know so many of our communities, women are the backbones of many Muslim communities. So, and I'm so happy to see that in this book. What about that? Like, did you want to show up in this book? You know, changing the idea about Muslim women, and you as a woman and your culture. What do you want people to understand?
We are just as you. We are just a human being. We wear a scarf, we wear hijab, but that doesn't mean we're not human. So we work, we help our family, we get married, we take care. We are just like everyone else. So whoever says, oh, oppressed or this or that, it's just misconception or not knowing the reality of other people. We care about our family, we care about our kids, and we take care of each other. So, and that's the human way, not a Muslim way or a Christian way. And so I think that's who we are. And that's what I knew how, and I did. And I wish people will understand, even if we're a refugee, we come here, we still want the best for everyone we meet and everyone we encounter. So
tell me a little bit about your life right now.
My life right now is amazing. I live with my parents and I see them every morning, and that's what I prayed for all these years. And I'm grateful to be with them and my whole family, my kids and my parents living together. So I'm so honored and I'm happy.
What do you see when you look at Ilhan Omar?
Very strong woman.
This idea, like, it really, when I was reading the book, her image just kept coming into my head. This idea that this struggle is happening at the same time that, you know, there is also a woman who was a Somali refugee who was able to come to this country, who was able to reach high office in the United States. What kind of hope does that give you?
It just tells me we can do anything. We are here to make it, and we just survive. And
you're survivors.
Very strong women. We don't hold back. We work hard, and we're just like everyone else. Even though we wear a scarf and we are Muslim and we are Black and whatever you guys put us, we're just human like you. We have dreams, we have hopes, and
How are your children? Marianne, are you with us? Okay. Let's go to Ty for a little bit. Ty, I was just talking a little earlier about Sudan, and we have a new government and things, we're hoping things will change. Do you think, you know, with the coming of the Biden administration, we talked about the refugee caps, but what are you seeing is will change sooner rather than later in this whole story of how America looks at refugees. The Trump administration and that era did so much damage in this regard. This fundamental question of people coming to this country and seeking refuge. Are we back at square one, or are we somewhere in the middle, or where do you see this?
I think we're stuck kind of at a crossroads here. The Biden administration is, of course, also contending with a pandemic that has profoundly affected mobility for everyone, not just for refugees. And I think that in some ways that is shaping the way that they approach these problems. In other ways, it's become an excuse for inaction. The policy questions and the question of language and rhetoric, I think, are easy to separate with the Biden administration. On the campaign trail, it was easy to see the ways in which Biden went out of his way to contrast his own vision with that of Trump's. He presented himself as, if not a champion for refugees, certainly someone who thought compassionately about them, thought that this issue was important, and sought to differentiate his platform from Trump's very cold, uncaring platform on that particular policy issue. It's clear, I think, to me now that I was hopeful in and I was giving him the benefit of the doubt of that while the campaign was happening, I think, because I wanted to read that. I wanted to hear that from an American leader. But if you look back at the historical record, Biden has never been very good on refugees. He opposed bringing many South Vietnamese refugees here after the end of the Vietnam War, including those that aided American soldiers in the war effort. He actively tried to prevent those people from being brought over in an emergency evacuation. He seems very unconcerned with the fate of Afghan refugees right now as the United States winds down the war in Afghanistan. And there was quite a damning piece in the New York Times yesterday or the day before looking at inside the Biden administration's flip-flop on this issue, why they initially said they would raise the cap, then they said that they were going to keep Trump's cap, then they said, oh, well, we'll raise it, but we're not going to give you any specific numbers. Of course, this is secondhand reporting relying on people who are in the room, but painted a picture of the chief executive who didn't think this was a top issue on his agenda and didn't merit the attention that it was getting. So I think that while the rhetoric has changed, the narrative has changed, we no longer have an administration that delights in the cruelty of these things. We don't have one that is actively trying to undo the policies that at the end of the day are the things that keep people from living the new lives that they hope that they'll be able to do. When the Biden administration said that they were going to raise the cap, the State Department evidently expected them to do that. And they booked 700 flights for refugees from around the world that they then had to cancel, very embarrassingly, in my view, and devastatingly for those who were expecting to get on those flights. It's not very often like you can just get on a later one. These things compound. There are reasons why refugees who are stranded there. I read about one woman who was pregnant and then has since had a child. And so now adding the child to her resettlement case is going to take months or years and more bureaucratic wrangling. And so she probably won't be on the next flight if there is a next flight. So these kinds of decisions have very, very profound ripple effects on people's lives.
And there are flights out all the time. A couple of days ago, there was a flight to Haiti. These flights kind of taking people back to Haiti as well. That's another kind of front as well. Well, we're starting to get some questions from the audience. Let's go to some. Here's somebody who said, as I understand it, the allowance for refugee numbers the president's being asked to approve are ceilings, not required targets to hit. And as such, the pacing and numbers of people actually resettled could be adjusted as the program's capacity to process them is restored. So, is Biden's reluctance to increase those numbers a political consideration, maintaining goodwill for other initiatives he's prioritizing? Or Are there on-the-ground realities that we should understand that make ramping up difficult or impossible?
You're correct. They are caps. They're not requirements. So in the last year of the Biden administration, of the Trump administration, for instance, the cap was 15,000, but the United States only resettled about 12,000 refugees. The fact of the matter, though, is that the cap remains at 15,000 now. So it really would need to be raised in order for the U.S. to begin resettling people at anywhere close to the level that we did prior to the Trump administration. It seems clear to me that it is a political calculation, that the Biden administration is very worried about looking soft on immigration as it stares down what it sees as a potential political liability with increased migration at the southern border, particularly from Central America. As I said earlier in the program, these are two totally separate policy issues. Asylum at the border is, of course, also a legal right that people have that for the last 4 years or part of that time, they have not been able to exercise the right that they have under international law to claim asylum in the United States. But it is nonetheless a separate issue than resettlement through the UN from third countries. That
right. One is DHS, right? Like the border is handled by DHS, and refugees are the State Department.
They're both interagency processes, and there are some limited overlap with them. But I think the biggest, certainly the most relevant piece or difference is that refugees who come through the UN system are vetted for years and years and years. It's just an incredible level of scrutiny that they have to endure, as Marianne can tell you, having been through that system. And so I think...
And still, Asad comes through the airport and you're waiting for him and he doesn't come through right away. And he's still held for interrogation at the airport after all that vetting.
Yes. And Asad was also vetted forever and ever, but he actually never came through the UN resettlement process. He came on a student visa for Princeton, and that was an incredibly difficult process just on its own. He had, this golden ticket in the form of a admission letter to Princeton, a full scholarship that covered all of his school fees, all of his living expenses. But of course, he didn't have a passport. He didn't have even a national ID at the time that he received that. And so he had to get what's called a conventional travel document from the UN that the embassy in Nairobi, the US embassy, was willing to place a visa into. So it was a separate system of vetting that was not through the UN. It was similar to any other foreign student who would come on a student visa to come here. But yes, he was certainly...
Even the Princeton acceptance letter did not help him in that airport.
No. And in fact, Princeton took this extraordinary step, in my view, of hiring a law firm to write a 15 or 20 page memo about all the reasons why he should not be, why the Trump travel ban should not apply to him. And, beginning with the fact that he was born in Kenya, not in Somalia, so he was technically not Somali, and going on through to the fact that he had a student visa. But that tells you, if a university on whose campus you've never set foot is, thinks it's necessary to hire a law firm to do an extraordinary amount of research and arm you with a memo before you begin the process of trying to travel here, tells you something about what kind of immigration hurdles you are going to have to clear.
Absolutely. We've got another question. What can we do as ordinary American citizens to support Marianne's efforts to bring her siblings to the U.S. and reunite the family? Also, how specifically can we as individuals or through advocacy organizations pressure the Biden administration to follow through on his promises during his campaign by doing better by refugees? So the first question is a direct one about Marianne and how to help her, and this broader question about keeping him accountable.
They're both questions of policy, and I think probably the most immediate way that you as a citizen can make a difference is, of course, through voting, but also through contacting your representative directly. Let them know that you support not just refugee resettlement, but that you would like to see reform of the program through which people get green cards. The waiting period for sponsoring a sibling for a green card is something like 14 years or something like that right now. I may have not have the correct number off the top of my head, but it's extraordinarily long and reflective of a system that desperately needs to be overhauled. I think that on the question of resettlement, there's actually a great deal more popular support for resettlement than many people realize, and certainly than Washington acts like. If you ask people in communities across the United States whether they support refugees resettling in their communities, overwhelmingly they say yes. In fact, during the Trump administration, one of the policies that Trump put in place was to give communities essentially veto power over whether or not they got refugees resettled into their communities. And it was clear to me that the Trump administration expected lots of communities to use that veto power, to say, we don't want refugees, send them to another community. That did not happen by and large. Overwhelmingly, communities voted to have resettlement proceed or even expand. Many communities, I think, have always understood that, particularly in places that have seen, loss in population, have been deindustrialized, have struggled economically, what an incredible boon refugees can be to these communities, and how they come and they revitalize places. They start businesses, they hire people. And so that's pretty well understood, I think, at a policy level among local officials. And I think it's pretty well understood by voters who, when they respond to surveys time and again, say that they're in favor of this issue. The holdup, to me, is in Washington, where I think there's a sense that people they don't believe that Americans really know what they want, and that there's a reluctance to enact what is clearly the popular will on this particular issue.
All right, we are about to wrap up. I don't see any more questions from the audience. So final thoughts, Ty. People are going to read this book. What do you want people to understand from it? What do you want people to really, really get out of it?
Yeah, I hope that they can gain a better sense of just how valuable the resettlement system is, both to the country and to the people that are able to begin their lives again as a result of it. I hope they could even imagine themselves in a system, in a condition of being displaced themselves. The fact that Americans have not had a war on their, home territory is purely an accident of history, and that tomorrow we could wake up and be affected ourselves. And I think that, so I hope that there's an ability to see that this is a system that we all benefit from in our own ways, and that is broken and badly in need of repair. And that I think that we can all do the work of starting to build it back block by block.
Marianne, when people read this book and read your story and the story of your family, what do you want them to understand? What do you want them to take away? Oh, hi, Marianne. Oh, you're muted. Sorry. Unmute. Yes, go ahead.
No one wants to start life all over in a new place or new. It's like, it's life, it happens, and we're not coming to America in bad intention, or being a refugee is not something we choose. So I just think people will take from this book how humans struggle, and they should open their heart and be open-minded, and to know people are struggling, I think.
All right. Well, thank you so much to both of you. Ty McCormick's new book is called Beyond the Sand and Sea, One Family's Quest for a Country to Call Home. Marianne Hassan joins us from Milwaukee, where she lives with her family. I'm so happy to say that sentence. Yes. And thanks to you, our audience, for your questions and for being here. Please join World Affairs next Wednesday, April 28th at 11 a.m. Pacific for another program from the new Middle East fault lines to atmospheric jihadism. I'm Hana Baba. I'm the host, again, of Cross Currents on KALW. You can listen to Cross Currents 91.7 FM on the radio or at kalw.org. You can also listen to my podcast, The Stoop, Stories from Across the Black Diaspora, on your podcast player. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your week.